I'm not sure because I have not seen those images. We do know that the sentiments surrounding the conflict between Israel and Hamas globally are very, very high. And the United States has provided very strong support to its ally Israel, which I believe is waging a legitimate war against Hamas and doing everything it can to protect civilians in its way, civilians that Hamas likes to use as human shields. So before we can possibly imagine if the United States is acting for its benefit, I don't believe the United States is acting for its benefit. The United States is acting out of shared values. We should remember the atrocities that occurred on October 7th for people in Iraq and the Kurdish government area. There was a genocide committed on innocent Israeli people in their homes, grandmothers, mothers, children, babies, even the unborn were murdered by Hamas with incredible barbarity, the like of we haven't seen since ISIS. And for that reason, standing with Israel means standing up against radical Islamist jihadism, the same jihadism for which Iraq and the Kurdish people and the Yazidi people have paid an extremely high price. The same jihadism that the Peshmerga stood against and defeated in Iraq and with the bordering areas of Syria. That is the fight at the moment. And so the United States is standing up for its ally and its values, values which I believe we share with many millions of people in Iraq, particularly the Kurdish people. Well, obviously, these attacks that are on US bases, many of the bases collaborate with Iraqi special forces, Kurdish special forces. These bases are, in fact, targets of Iranian proxy war. Much of Iraq is now under the influence of Iranian elements, whether Iranian militia, whether Iranian proxy forces. We know that inside Iraq, the IRGC has bases that it mans with anti-aircraft missiles, which are aimed at US interests. Those US interests can be Tel Aviv. Those US interests can be Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. That is occurring whether or not the Iraqi people like. It's a painful reality that one of the worst legacies of the United States war that began on Iraq has been that Iraq has fallen under the influence of Iran. And Iran is a committed proxy enemy of the United States at the moment. So before the United States would even make any gestures of retaliation, it's doing everything in its power to limit the damage to its own citizens, its own interests, and very much limit escalation of this conflict into the wider region. By that, I mean, we do not want to see Hezbollah enter the theater of war because it would mean Iraq would become a major staging ground to support Iran's war on Israel. And that would be devastating for the United States and Israel and Iraq. Listen, I have just come back from not only Tel Aviv, but from the actual zone of war. I have come back from the Gaza border region where I have been there with the Israeli Defense Forces. I am familiar with the incredible lengths to which the Israeli military goes to minimize civilian harm. They have clearly demarcated a war zone and made enormous efforts to move civilian populations away from the theater of war. That's happening on the ground. Israeli military leaves its tanks, comes out of the tanks, and goes on the ground to clear the area of civilians, having been telephoning and messaging Palestinian civilians to move away from the place of conflict. And so the question of how quickly this is going to end, I would say this is going to be a very methodical, very sustained, very, very cool and calm military operation, which will not leave any point of survival for Hamas. I think there's no question about that. In the meantime, we know even just within the last few hours, a Hezbollah anti-tank missile landed on a civilian member of the Israeli population in the northern border. Now, 200,000 Israelis have been displaced in this conflict already inside Israel, because the civilian populations have also been moved away from the borders in Israel. And yet Hezbollah is repeatedly attacking and targeting soft targets in the form of civilians. Both Hamas and Hezbollah exploit civilian targets. They do so with impunity because they do not have conventional values. They are terrorist actors. And so the risk for this expanding regionally is very high, but both the United States and Israel are very, very much interested in restraining the conflict from expanding. I agree. The loss of human life is devastating. I think the loss of human life, even one human life, is devastating, let alone hundreds and, in fact, thousands on the Israeli side have been wounded. Hundreds, over 1,400 have been murdered on the Israeli side already, not mentioning any combat losses that they've already sustained. And then the thousands of civilians that have been lost in the Gaza section. Much of that is related to the Hamas policy of denying shelter to the Palestinian civilians. They forbid them from evacuating the zone of war. They prevent them from leaving to the south. They prevent them from seeking shelter in the 300 miles of subterranean tunnels that Hamas has built, which could be very strong shelter from any conflict. I've been inside those tunnels. So a lot of the civilian losses are being sustained because of Hamas policies. Hamas is a genocidal terrorist movement. It is not a liberation organization. It is a movement that is committed to the eradication of Israel and the murder of every Jew possible. If that costs human Palestinian life to Hamas, that's an acceptable loss. And so I would entirely agree with you. The death of civilians, the death of women and children is devastating. The numbers in Gaza are appalling. Hamas is using these images and figures and exacerbating these deaths to satisfy its own political aims. Israel consults with legal military lawyers before any strike. Its strikes are very precise because the Israeli infantry is on the ground, so they don't want to bomb their own infantry. These civilian losses could also be greatly mitigated by the Arab world providing shelter to the Gazan civilians, which the world has not yet done, but is working on humanitarian corridors, which Secretary of State Blinken is also working on. So I'm hopeful that there will be more safe spaces created to minimize these deaths. But I agree with you. So that's a great question, particularly because I am a doctor and I work in hospitals with patients. And so I very much am concerned about this. We also saw atrocities focusing on hospitals for the last 10 or more years in Syria. This has been a policy of the war of Syria inside its own civil war. So Muslim countries are, in fact, much worse offenders at this. It is, however, very clearly shown that Hamas uses civilian structures. Only last night, Hamas commandos were found using an ambulance for movement. I met many eyewitnesses who were confronted by Hamas commandos in their own homes, dressed in Israeli uniform. Hamas is a terrorist organization, as I emphasize, which does not care about the future or sanctity of Palestinian life in any way. So you must forget that assumption that it is functioning like any kind of civilized state actor. It therefore uses hospitals, children's schools, kindergartens, children themselves to hide its terrorist operation. A better question to ask would be, why have not the billions of dollars poured into Gaza for decades not built shelters for its own people, additional schools? Instead, all of that money has gone to create a terrorist infrastructure. I do agree countries like Iraq have a very big role to play, including with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with Jordan, to create rapid safe havens to allow the civilians to flee. But those countries are also not engaging because they are concerned about their own national security concerns as well. Great question. So there's no occupation of Gaza since 2006 when Hamas won elections and took over governance. That area has been under the leadership of Hamas. As soon as Hamas won elections, it executed its own political opposition, the Palestinian Authority. Hamas's war against Israel is not only about Israel, it's also about subjugating the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. The responsibilities of governing the Palestinian people fall entirely on Hamas. Hamas leaders are sitting in Qatar with net worth of $2.5 billion, Khalid Mishal. They live in air conditioning. They're not in Gaza. They're moving around the Arab world. They come to Beirut. They are the ones who have abandoned the Palestinian people. I was in the White House in January 2020 when Jared Kushner and President Trump presented the Palestinian Peace for Prosperity Plan, which would have involved $50 billion of investment from the Gulf in exchange for peace, and that was declined. And so the most beleaguered and pitiful people in the Middle East, the Palestinians, have been absolutely abandoned by their own leadership. You need to understand Hamas cares nothing for human life. Hamas is only concerned with the elimination and eradication of Jewish life, even if it costs the very last life of a Palestinian. It is not fighting for Palestinian liberation. But I do believe in Palestinian sovereignty, and I do believe in the right to Palestinian statehood and a two-state solution. It's not going to come with Hamas.